Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am delighted this morning to welcome one of our Literary Festival authors this morning. Literary Festival author, historian, and professor Katherine Sharp Landdeck is here to give us a preview of her appearance at this year's festival, which will run from April 28th to the 30th at venues throughout the city on Saturday and online on Sunday. Katherine Sharp Landdeck's appearance will be April 30th at noon. Dr. Landdeck's book is The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. Professor Landdeck is an associate professor of history at Texas Woman's University. She's a Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and has received numerous awards for her work on the women Air Force service pilots. She's appeared on the History Channel, on PBS. She's published in many popular magazines, such as the Atlantic Monthly, as well as academic and aviation publications. She's also herself a licensed pilot and has said that she takes every chance to fly that she's able to get. We're honored to have her with us today. So first of all, Kate, welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is very fun.
It is totally my pleasure. And let's start at the beginning, Kate. Tell us, who were the women with silver wings and what role did they play helping us win World War II?
Right. Well, thank you so much for asking. I've wanted to tell people about these women for so long. So I appreciate having this chance. You know, the women with silver wings that the book is named for are the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. These were women who wanted to fly, wanted to serve their country, and in September of 1942 were finally given the chance. They came into the Army Air Forces as civilians, which was something the Army Air Forces did with men who already had flying time. They'd bring them in for 90 days and then make them second lieutenants. That was kind of the plan with the women. It didn't work out that way, but that was the plan. So these women came in and their initial job was to ferry airplanes, right? We think of World War II and all the manufacturing that was done and Rosie the Riveter and all of that. Well, all those planes that were being built in Dallas and Detroit and Los Angeles and everywhere had to be flown to both coasts and put on ships and taken away or flown if they were big enough. And so that was the first job the women did, was they ferried those planes from the factories to those points of embarkation. And then they did every job that needed to be done, basically. You know, they flew over 60 million miles. 12,000 different aircraft. It was just really, they did the work that needed to be done so that the men could fight in combat, not do domestic flying.
Yeah, when I saw that statistic about the number of miles and number of flights, I was stunned. That's a lot of flying time. But it had to be done. World War II was an aerial war. And it was a relatively new kind of war for the United States to be fighting. And so their role really was pivotal. And they also used to fly flights dragging targets behind them, right? So that well, you tell us about the live ammunition.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I love that people grab onto that piece because it's, you know, when the women were first brought in, it was as these ferry pilots, you know, take the planes, and they were limited to really light aircraft. You know, here's a Piper Cub, fly it from here to there. Here's a little Taylor craft. And then they proved that they were good pilots. They had a lot of flying time in the beginning, and they started flying AT-6 Texans, and then eventually P-51 Mustangs, P-38s, all of them. But by the spring and early summer of 1943, the Army Air Forces is like, maybe we can use these girls for something else. And that's what they call them, the girls, right?
Yeah.
But they needed flying. You know, you think of men going to war and they're just boys, you know, so many of them. and they've got to learn how to fire those big guns against airplanes. And so the way they would do that is they'd have the gunners on the ground, and they'd have an aircraft fly past with a tow target behind it. If you've ever been to the beach or a football game or something and see a banner being towed behind a plane, imagine that, a little bit bigger scale. And yeah, the gunners shooting live ammunition at the target as the pilot was supposed to very calmly go back and forth. They did that on everything from ground gunners to air. We see all the movies of the B-17 gunners firing against the Germans. We had to teach the guys how to do that. So you'd have two B-17s rendezvous and take turns shooting at each other. And, the kids in the back got 3 shots before they were shipped overseas, which is just stunning. But those are all jobs the women could do. Yeah. When they were flying and release those men for the other duties.
So they weren't just skilled and talented pilots ferrying airplanes hither and yon. They had guts and gumption.
They had nerve. They definitely
I'll say.
Nerve, for sure. Absolutely.
Well, Kate, one of the things that was interesting to me about your book was learning about how you used the phrase air crazy, that the United States was in the 1920s and 30s, which partly meant that there was a pool of talented pilots available, male and female. But I didn't realize what air crazy meant until I was reading in your book about how popular aviation performances were and stunts. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what air crazy meant in the 20s and 30s.
Oh, yeah. I thank you so much for asking me that question. Not very many people do, and I love talking about it. You talk about these women, and 25,000 applied. 25,000 women applied to this program, to the WASP, and that's surprising a lot of times. What do you mean 25,000? Yeah. I actually thought Jacqueline Cochran, who ran the program, had made it up because she made things up. But I've seen the letters, I've seen the applications at the National Archives, and part of the explanation for why so many women applied, of course, is that the 1920s and especially the 1930s was this air age, the golden age of aviation, we call it. And think about Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. These were these women's contemporaries. Jacqueline Cochran was good friends with Amelia Earhart. Nancy Love, the other leader, was good friends with Amelia Earhart. And everyone loved airplanes. They had newspaper columns, they had magazines, they had, the reels at the movies of aviation feats. This was a time of great accomplishments, air racing and altitude and distance, and the technology was growing so much and so new that it was always in the news. Air races were the big thing. More people went to air races and air shows, and you think of air races, think of a car race where they go around and around, right? Obviously I lived in Tennessee for a while, so NASCAR is something I think of racing, right? But they would do that with airplanes, right? They'd have big pylons in the air and they'd go around them.
Wow.
Thousands of people would attend these events. It was more popular than college football, more popular than college baseball. I mean, it was just so crazy. And so these women grew up in that golden age of aviation. Some of them were even famous pilots. Teresa James was a big air show pilot. She made $50 a weekend in the middle of the Depression doing these stunts. Helen Ritchie had all sorts of aerial records, staying in the air for 10 days with different women partners in one plane as a stunt. Got all sorts of media, got fed from another plane that would drop food to them, on a string, just all open cockpit, of course. So it was just, it was madness. People loved airplanes and what they could be.
Yeah.
There's a really good book by Joseph Korn called Winged Gospel. And I highly recommend it. He takes it through the whole thing. And I think it's one of my favorite books. Of course, I'm in aviation. So but it's really well written, and you really get the feeling of how immersive aviation was at the time. So
Yeah,
thank you for asking that.
well, thank you for describing it, because I had no idea about just how popular aviation was and the kinds of like races and stunts as you described them.
Mhm.
I just had no idea. So it's fascinating to learn about both the phenomenon in and of itself, but also how historically then it set the context for there being a pool of talented pilots
Mhm.
who were able, ready, and willing then to be enlisted into the service of flying airplanes for military purposes when World War II
Mhm.
sadly rolled around. So thank you for that, Kate.
Oh,
You
good.
know, one of the other pleasures of your book is the abundance of stories about the women of just exceptional leadership, grit, bravery, and determination, dedication
Mhm.
to the war effort, and lots of colorful personalities. You've already referenced to the very, very different Nancy Love and Jackie Cochran. But you spend a lot of time going around meeting many of
Mhm.
these surviving pilots at the time, and you certainly know about probably every one of them. So I was hoping that you would share with us maybe one or two stories about, just two of the pilots that you profiled whom you remember most fondly, or whom you especially admired, and what it was about them that made them stand out to you personally.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's, I was so lucky. I met my first WASP in 1993 and had never heard of them, and was like blown away and started down my serious research road with them. But it by coming into it with that personal connection, into their story, I was then invited to different events and started doing oral histories, which was a big tool, because at the time there'd been no gathering of letters, no gathering of papers. Like, as a historian, it's of the 20th century, sometimes that's our struggle, is finding the materials because they haven't been donated yet, right? The people are
Ah,
still, right? These women were in their 70s,
yeah.
when I met them, which is young, and they hadn't started donating. They just created the archive at Texas Women's University. There was one collection of 20 boxes, and that was it. So if I wanted to do this history well, I had to do oral histories. So I got
Yeah.
to meet them and spend all this time with them. And yeah, the way I wrote the book was kind of with lead characters. They're all real
Yeah.
women, but that was a struggle because there's 1,800 women. How do you
Yeah.
tell that story, right?
Yeah.
So I chose women that I knew. I never knew Nancy or Jackie, who were the leaders, but the five women I kind of follow through the whole story, I was lucky enough to know pretty well. I think Teresa James is one of those that she could help us tell the story from the 1930s with that stunting all the way through the war years. And she was a ferry pilot, and did the post-war work trying to get them recognized as veterans. And she's from Pennsylvania. Her family still owns the James family floral shop. And she was terrified of flying, hated airplanes, and then started flying to impress a boy, and became this fantastic pilot. And she was, I think, one of the funniest people I've ever met. She laughed all the time, just this big curly hair, just loved to make people laugh, thought everything was so funny, and really loved encouraging the young people just with her humor and style. She was just so funny. I think another one that's in the book that was a very close friend of mine that I knew, probably among the best of all of them that I knew, was Marty Weil. And she's not as strong a character in the book as Teresa, I think, because she's in the last class. And I really used her to tell the story of those women who came in with only 35 hours of flying time and went through the whole training program, which was out in Sweetwater, Texas at the time. And then she has a pretty interesting post-war life, and then is the one that really saves all the papers and helps with the fight to become veterans and brings the women back together in the 60s. And Marty was tiny. She was this little bitty thing. Of course, she got tinier the closer to 85 and 90 she got.
Anyway, it happens to us all.
It happens to all of us. But she was very tough. She lived on they had land in Indiana, and she loved flying. She was, I think, the most stubborn of the most stubborn group of women I know. But she was loyal and helpful and kind. But every time I'd see her, I worked on this project for years, decades even, if truth be told. And every time I would see her, and I was lucky enough to get to see Marty 3 or 4 times a year at different events, and we'd spend time together. And every time she'd say, "Katie, how's the book?" I'd say, "Marty, I'm working on it." She'd say, "Still?" So she was my biggest motivator for sure, because it's like, I got to get some new chapters written. I'm going to see Marty next week. So she was just so supportive and wonderful. She was just a great friend for sure. I was very lucky to get to know her.
Well, those are great stories, and you make them come alive as you describe them. And I have to say, you have to admire somebody who decides that in order to impress a young man, she decides, I'll learn to fly. I mean, you gotta admire and appreciate that.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And of course, it was the other guys on the airfield that were goading her into doing it. I think because they wanted her to forget him and hang out with them. So it was, 19-year-old romance kind of thing, right?
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Well, what happened to these pilots after the war was over?
Right. Well, I think that's a big part of this story is, they did so much work. They did the ferrying, they did the towing of targets, but then they really got their work expanded. Jackie Cochran called them the aerial dishwashers, right? They would, nobody likes to do dishes.
Right.
And if you do, you can come down to Texas. And anytime, right?
This is why we have machines, Kate.
Right. But somebody has to do them, right?
Yeah,
they have to be
you still have to load them into the machine.
That's right. And Jackie Cochran said to the Air Force generals, Hap Arnold and General George and General Tunner said, look, these women can be the aerial dishwashers, right? They'll do that flying that has to be done, but isn't glamorous, right? I mean, it's not glamorous to fly a target back and forth, right? It's not glamorous to test fly an airplane after it's been broken, right? Or repaired. Those maintenance test flights. It's not glamorous to be the weather plane. It's not glamorous. One WASP flew the Army chaplain from her base to 7 different bases every Sunday so he could give his service. Of course, she said she didn't go to church for 10 years after the war because she'd gotten all her churching in those flights, those Sundays. But she, that's that you don't write home and brag about that if you're a 20-year-old fighter jock. You want to go and be the hero. So these were all jobs that had to be done. And the training that needed to be done and the flying that needed to be done. And so these women did it, right? They filled all these different jobs. They were on over 200 bases across the country. They did important work. But as the war shifted, there was an attempt to bring them into the military in the summer of 1944 for months leading up to it. But their bill comes before Congress to put them in the military in June of 1944, right after D-Day. And everybody wants the war to be over, and everybody wants the women to get back home, right? So the same actions that we see with Rosie the Riveter being pushed out of the factory because the men were home to do those jobs. We see with the women pilots, where it's like, no, you did a great job. atta girl, but now we've got enough pilots that are surviving the war. We've got enough, the war is going well. You girls can go.
Yeah.
Thank you. And they went home without recognition as veterans, right? They'd been serving in the Army Air Forces. They'd been wearing uniforms. They could get court-martialed. They got demerits in training. They, all these things. Their orders are official, and they got official discharges, right? The paperwork all was Army Air Forces paperwork, but they weren't officially brought in. So they leave, and they can't fly for the airlines despite their flight time because they're girls, and the airlines doesn't want to hire women because they have enough men pilots, right? Not every man could get a flying job as a pilot, as a airline pilot either. But they were really limited. They didn't get the GI Bill, so they couldn't go to college on that. And so a lot of them said to me in their interviews later, they really would have wanted to do that. They really wanted to go to college. And these were really educated, smart women.
Yeah.
So they had to find their own way. Some of them, got married and had kids right away. Some of them kept flying. The first woman I met, Carol Bailey Bosca, the way I met her was she was talking with Curtis Pitts. If you've got aviation people, they know who that is. Talking to Curtis Pitts, and she was the 1951 International Aerobatic Champion in the #2 Pitts Special, which is probably the coolest aerobatic plane. And so she, after the war, she and a group of her friends flew air shows and test flying and stunt flying and things like that. But that only lasts so long. And you can't make a very good living at it. And so you have about 30% of the women kept flying in the years after the war, but it's really expensive. So you've got to have it either be your job, which some of them worked as flight instructors or owned their own little aviation business, or you've got to be really rich.
Yeah.
And even the rich people, it can get too rich, So they just had to ease back into life. And I think one distinction between them and the men who face some of those same challenges, right? That reality of how do you go from being at war to being a civilian again? That's a real struggle that veterans of any conflict face. But the distinction is the men were able to join different clubs and veterans of foreign wars and different things like that, and the women were shut out. They were not allowed to join those clubs because they weren't veterans. So Dora Dougherty was one of my leads. Fantastic, brilliant woman, got her PhD, was a human flight engineer at Bell Helicopter for decades. But she flew the B-29, the Super Fortress, and had all this flight experience. Went to school in Chicago and tried to join one of the veterans clubs and was kicked out. So the people who she could speak their language and feel comfortable with, she couldn't hang out with, and the other women and that she was supposed to hang out with, she didn't feel comfortable with because she'd been a pilot on a military base for the last 2 years. So it was a struggle for a lot of them.
Yeah, well, it's an old and all too familiar story. But part of what also happens then, because of the forces that you were just describing, is their history disappears and fades, and we don't know about it. Thanks to your book now, we know more about it. But in your opinion, Kate, why is it important that we learn about and remember the important role that these women pilots played in winning World War II and in American history?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question a lot. That's a really good question. I think, obviously I want people to remember them because they were my friends and they're very cool. But as a historian, I think it's important to recognize, first of all, that this is an important chapter in World War II, in American
Yeah.
World War II history, is that women were doing this. Women weren't, nurses were very important, but that's the image people have, is women were
Yeah.
either Rosie the Riveters or nurses.
Yeah.
Like, no, the jobs that people did on the home front were so diverse and so important. I think these women took real risks. 38 women were killed during the war doing this work, which is on par with the number of men doing the same work who were killed. But you know, we need to remember them and the sacrifice they and their families made. They didn't get the gold star. They didn't get the flag on their coffin. So I think that's important. But you know, as a girl who grew up loving airplanes and not understanding that women could fly, despite supportive family and things, it's like I didn't know any pilots, so I didn't know, you know, and I think it's so important for people to dream big, right? And this idea of looking up at an airplane and imagining yourself in it is just so crazy, you know.
Yeah.
And to know that women did this in the 1940s.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's been
Right.
so long.
Right.
And even today, women are only 7% of all pilots.
Yeah.
Which is just stunning to me. And so I think having these women as role models, they were young, they were, you know, in their late teens to mid 20s, most of them. And they went out there and they flew the best airplanes of the day, the very best. And I think just so people can realize, men and women, boys and girls can say, oh, wait, girls can do that. Women can do that. Will kind of open the idea of what the war was and what the possibilities for the future can be.
It's both important to tell the complete story and also to make it clear the many different roles that women played, not just nurses, but pilots, and the story of women code breakers is also starting to you know, pierce through the neglect of history, and also to open the imaginations. And young women out there, you can impress a boy. Learn to fly.
That's right.
Kate, thank you so much, you know, for the stories you tell and the Women with Silver Wings. Let me just let people know about your appearance at the festival. Again, Kate will be appearing on Sunday, April 30th at noon. The festival website where you can register for Kate's event via Zoom is easy to remember. It's NewburyportLiteraryFestival.org. The title of her session is Two Ways to Tell a Story, Two Authors' Take on the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. Kate will be in conversation with novelist Elena Dillon, whose novel Eyes Turned Skyward features a modern-day women's Air Force service pilot and her quest to be recognized. Kate has her own website as well, and that website is Katherine Sharp Landdeck, and Katherine is spelled Katherine, Sharp, and then Landdeck.com. Kate, thank you so much. It's just been lovely to have you with us today. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your book, which both restores history and opens our imagination. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
It's been a joy to have you. It's been really fun to learn from you and talk with you. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, everybody, be well. Bye-bye.